So a little bit of stress, once you've gone through it and successful, you've got an inoculation. Now you can handle a little bit more stress and a little bit more stress up to a point. So that without those stress exposures, we don't learn to become resilient. We don't learn to manage those bigger stressors. And childhood is when we're supposed to get a lot of that stress inoculation. We've kind of removed that from the equation of modern day childhood with the way parenting and public schools function to remove stress from the lives of children and adolescents.
Team, welcome back to another week here with Drew and Alex, episode 4792, I think.
Roughly.
Alex, great to have you on again. Welcome back.
Good to be here, Drew, after 4,000 and change episodes.
I know,
Still going strong.
We've come so far. You have a story for us?
No, not a story necessarily, a forecast for an upcoming potential disaster.
For yourself or for the world?
Not for me. It won't affect me at all.
Oh,
but I'll get to find out what happened in a couple of days.
North Carolina congressman?
Well, that's an entirely different disaster. All people would have to do is Google that to find out what Drew is talking about. That is too much to even talk about on the podcast. Anyway, listeners will know I live in Colorado. I love skiing. Can't wait for some snow to arrive. So this time of year where we're getting into fall, leaves are changing color, weather's getting colder, stuff like that. Always wondering when we're going to get first real snow. There's been some dustings up in the mountains, but nothing serious down by us yet. It's pretty predictably still like not even really fall right now. It's still warm outside and things like that. But coming up this weekend is the Pikes Peak Ascent and the Pikes Peak Marathon. That's Saturday. There's a race where you just run up Pikes Peak. It's about half marathon distance up a mountain. And on Sunday, if you're doing the full marathon, you run all the way up the mountain and all the way back down, making it marathon distance. Just up a mountain. It's not a good time. I haven't done it, so I couldn't tell you. I've hiked the mountain, but I definitely have not raced it.
That road's only 13 miles.
You do it on the trail.
Do they still race cars up Pikes Peak?
Yeah, they still do. I can't remember what it's called. Pikes Peak International Hill Climb. Yeah.
Something like that. Anyway, keep going.
Bunch of funky cars.
Mm-hmm.
But we're getting close to race weekend, and I'm checking the forecast. This is the summit forecast of the mountain, which they have to go to on either race. Saturday, high of 37, but the snow percentage starts at 30% and gets up to 80%. Saturday night, overnight, 90%. Sunday, 40%. The official weather.gov Colorado Springs Pike Peak Summit extended forecast calls for just shy of a foot over the course of that period. I have seen some decently reliable mountain forecasts calling for up to 20 inches potentially over the course of the weekend. I don't know how it's all going to go down. By the time this episode publishes, it'll be 2 weeks afterwards. So maybe my prediction was completely wrong. Who knows? But I foresee an absolute mess for folks who are starting a run when it's warm and 5,000 feet below the summit of the mountain, 6,000 feet below the summit of the mountain. More than that, I don't even know where they start. And then running up into a snowstorm at the top.
I mean, that's your fault for running up a mountain.
I mean, true.
I rode a mountain bike up a mountain once, and it was the worst thing I've ever done. So,
how big was the mountain?
It's Mount Lemmon in Tucson. For people
that's there's actually some pretty cool stuff on Mount Lemmon. Mount Lemmon's awesome. There's rock
gravel
climbing
bike.
there.
Yeah, no, it's a great mountain. Love it. Gravel bike race. Didn't
on
realize. Trail? Yes, my buddy and I. Shout out Taylor Gum. We did it without training, thinking this will be fun. Lined up. There were pros there. So new rule of thumb emerged from that race, which is that if there are pros signed up, you should train for it. We finished in last place.
Nice.
In the entire event. And I thought both of my femurs were going to snap because my
last place by a little bit or last place by a lot?
Last place as in they didn't let us finish because they're hey, you guys have been out here
for too long. Took you off the course.
Yeah.
Perfect.
It was great. And I don't know if people have had a real muscle cramp, but I thought my femurs were going to snap in half because my quads were cramping so bad. So anyway,
I'll share. This is not usually in the banter of the episode. This is a lesson about military fitness and stuff. This belongs in the meat of the episode. But the military has this thing where if you were tough enough, you could just do stuff without training. So people would just sign up for half marathons and marathons and then don't train for them.
It's not
and
true.
They call that discipline.
It's not discipline.
Discipline would be
training
for it.
Yeah. which I didn't do because I had no discipline and I got screwed.
It's also a great way to get injured.
Yeah, it was horrible. Speaking of meat of the episode, who are we talking to?
Drew tries very hard to get nice, clean transitions from the banter into the episode, even though we do not plan them to have any
Speaking
connection
of
to each other.
speaking of climbing mountains.
I'm sure our guest for this episode is very disciplined, so it ties in
Hey, there you
nicely.
go. Speaking of discipline,
He is a returning guest. This is
part
not the
D.
first time, and if you have not listened to the previous episode, highly recommend it. It's one of those contentious topics we keep hitting on, veteran disability stuff.
Hmm.
But in this episode, we're not necessarily talking about veteran disability. Our guest, Chris Frueh, is a clinical psychologist. He is a professor of psychology at the University of Hawaii. He's done various other jobs in academia, 30 years of professional experience working with military veterans, active duty, wide-ranging populations, but a particular focus on special operations. He's done clinical trials. He's done epidemiology. He did a really cool historical analysis looking at U.S. Army suicides all the way back to 1819. He has co-authored over 300 scientific publications and appeared in numerous publications: Huffington Post, New York Times, Washington Post, National Review, The Economist, all the big ones. Even Men's Health. Look at that.
Hmm.
But we're here to talk about his latest book, which is also a topic he has discussed extensively. You've likely heard it in some research and things like that. It's all about operator syndrome, known in some circles as high allostatic load. If you want to get sciencey, we hash that out a little bit on the episode. Essentially, the unique set of symptoms or reactions or responses that come from the stressful nature of special operations service in particular, but there are certainly other places where that pattern emerges as well. You'll hear him in the episode talks a little bit about talking to law enforcement populations, other populations that experience similar medical outcomes.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that the two of us, you and I, are quite fascinated by modern warfare, but with modern warfare comes new and interesting problems, specifically in this episode, operator syndrome. I think there's probably a fair number of folks listening that will have never heard of that term before, but then as Chris is talking about it, will say, that sounds like me. Which, if that is you, or you're interested in this type of stuff, you mentioned his book, but you can also just Google the term at this point and come across a fair amount of information. I would imagine, based on how things are going overseas right now, that this is a problem that's only going to get bigger. And so the work that he's doing is that much more important. The conversation is that much more relevant, and it's a fascinating one.
The underlying theme that I hope people listen for here, because it's easy to like hear the term operator syndrome and think, oh, that's just a thing that only affects operators. But operator syndrome at its root comes from just being stressed in a variety of different ways a lot of the time, getting essentially knocked out of your comfort zone repeatedly.
Mhm.
And the observation here is that that stress does manifest itself in some unique health and medical ways. And you certainly don't need to be an operator to be exposed to a lot of stressors. You might be exposed to different ones. You might not get hit in the head as much or be exposed to as much heavy metal residue or something. Like those can be different. But lots of people live lives where they're exposed to varieties of frequent stressors, and a better awareness of how that affects your health and how you can mitigate the effects on your health can help basically anyone.
So, refer to the show notes. We'll have links in there for the book, some of his articles, not all 300 of them, but a fair few. And yeah, enjoy the episode.
Drew loves to promise things in the show notes, knowing he's not the one who has
I'm
to
not the
put
one that
them
has to do
together.
them. Alex will put links to all 300 papers in the show notes. So again, enjoy.
I think defining terms is a good place to start. I have a couple of terms we need to define, but we should probably start with the big one. So what is operator syndrome?
Well, operator syndrome is what I and others are referring to as a framework that describes the types of injuries and impairments that we see really commonly in military special operators, But I just want to be really clear. We see it in combatants
Mm.
from all MOSs. We see variations of it in paramilitary, private defense contractors. I was out last week in Los Angeles, got to speak to to an audience of tactical federal agents and urban SWAT units, firefighters, law enforcement. Essentially, all of our society's warriors, protectors have a collection of inevitable injuries and impairments from their professional work. And the reason that we're calling this operator syndrome is kind of that's where it started. That's been where my work the last decade has been. And military special operators incur an incredibly massive dose of exposures that cause injuries that is in excess of most professional warriors. So they're constantly training, for example, constantly training with demolitions, breaching, shoulder-fired rockets, jumping out of airplanes, diving, rucking, rappelling, living and working in austere environments that frequently have extensive toxic exposures. You have incredibly high operational tempos, the high op tempo, the sleep deprivation that goes into the kind of work and missions that they perform, as well as training, and the circadian disruption of night work, jetting around the world on a moment's notice sometimes. So it's a framework for understanding those issues, those injuries, those impairments, and I can give a real quick, just sort of rattle off a list of some of these things. But it really starts with traumatic brain injury, and then you have sleep disturbance with sleep apnea, endocrine dysfunction, which is dysregulation of hormones, especially testosterone in male operators, chronic pain with orthopedic problems, headaches, depression, anxiety, anger, hypervigilance, PTSD, addiction. Then you get into some of the impairments in perceptual systems. So hearing, vision, and balance. TBI often causes impairments to balance. You have cognitive impairments, also, again, common with psychological issues, but also especially traumatic brain injury. And then all of this cascades into social functioning. So marital issues, family challenges, difficulties with emotional intimacy, sexual intimacy. For military folks, there comes a point where they have to take off the uniform and become civilians again. For law enforcement, that transition point between profession and home happens daily, multiple times a week. So you're on a shift and then you go home. You've got that transition point. We're now looking at and talking much more about toxic exposure, the respiratory illnesses and cancers that can lead to, which is especially a concern in firefighters, in the firefighter community. And then last, certainly not least, are the existential concerns, which we can define in a wide range of they manifest in a lot of different ways. So it could be guilt about something you've done, guilt about something you didn't do, grief, of course, survivor's guilt, loss of purpose, loss of tribe, a mindset that discounts the future because that future may not be here for you. Sometimes we refer to moral injury. We call things moral injury, which I think is a phrase I've never really loved, but I'm starting to sort of let it into my vernacular, into my own conversations a bit. I don't think we have a clear definition of what moral injury is. I think there's different definitions of it, but for me, I think I will define moral injury as being some type of betrayal from institutions or authorities. So the pullout from Afghanistan and Kabul, leaving behind so many allies, leaving behind Americans, leaving behind the amount of money and materiel that we that we did. I think for many people, that was an institutional betrayal of the US government, the Pentagon, the POTUS. And, that betrayal maybe according to many people, may be a moral injury. And if we take all of this and we think of it as these are essentially inevitable injuries and impairments that come from a career in special operations, where we need to be mindful of the downstream effects, which often include, really bad outcomes for guys and gals, divorces, and suicide, sort of maybe at the top of that list. Suicide being the most tragic, the most catastrophic for an individual and for families. Two other points I would make about operator syndrome. One is it's not a diagnosis, it's a framework. So we can use it as a framework for understanding, late stage injuries, and when an operator or a law enforcement officer or a soldier gets into their late 30s, 40s, we can think of it as a way of understanding the types of injuries they're likely to have. Also, we can think of it as a framework to understand human performance. So if we take an approach earlier in a career to optimizing health and wellness and performance, these are domains where we can implement strategies and approaches to partially to minimize the injuries, but also to extend careers, to extend the longevity of how long you can function and work in a given dangerous profession.
I mean, I know kind of giving it the label operator syndrome for most people, I think implies that this is, and you mentioned special operations, which for most folks is kind of a war on terror thing. It's a very current.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, is this something that we have seen precedent for in the past? I'm thinking of like the type of stuff that guys in World War I were exposed to, World War II, et cetera. I mean, what sort of role has the history of this played in some of your findings?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I don't get that question very often, so thank you for thinking that through.
You're welcome.
We don't have data, really, but I don't know of any data on the testosterone of returning World War I veterans. There probably isn't any. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's out there and I just haven't known where to look for it. But what I would say is it's a very logical leap to that. We had a name for what the World War I soldiers, many of them experienced after or during and after the war. We often referred to it as shell shock back at that time. And the name itself, it sort of opens the door is a clue to how they were understanding it at the time. So the idea of shell shock was that it was a neurological condition caused by the flashing lights and the big booms of artillery, primarily. And this was World War I was an artillery war. It was trench warfare with soldiers being crammed into little trenches that were heavily bombarded by artillery from the other side. And so, yeah, I think when we think of blast exposures, those soldiers just got massive doses. So it would make a lot of sense to me. There's a really cool article by Daniel Pearl and another colleague that was published 12 years ago. And just really quickly, just to say who Pearl is, Dr. Pearl is a pathologist. He's a neurological pathologist. He works at Walter Reed, and he's currently at the forefront of studying the effects of blast exposures on soldiers. So his lab, they do work with brains post-mortem, usually frequently after a soldier or a veteran has taken their life. If the brain is intact, they can then take that brain, they can look at the types of the training exposures that they had and the combat exposures, and they're looking at the different types of injuries in the brain. And one of the things his team has found and has labeled is a very unique and specific pattern of brain injury caused not by impact forces, but by blast exposures. So it's a different signature in the brain that they've discovered, different type of injury in the brain. They've called it interface astroglial scarring in 2016 paper. And that what they're describing is a pattern of scarring in the glial cells of the brain. The glial cells are the scaffolding cells. These are the cells that hold the neurons in place, insulate them, clean them, take out the garbage and waste materials. So they're very important support cells, and those get scarred by blasts.
Hmm.
So Dr. Pearl in 2012 wrote I thought, just a scintillating critique. Sorry for using that word. Wrote
Love that word.
Wrote a one. I get 50 cents for that, right?
Yeah.
Wrote just a wonderful critique of the whole field of PTSD. And essentially, and I've had some conversations with him about this, essentially what he believes is psychologists and psychiatrists have been getting it wrong ever since World War One. We've turned what he views as a neurological disorder then into a psychological disorder that's more about the psyche and less about the physiology of the brain. So I think if we go back to shell shock, I'm gonna agree with Dr. Pearl. I think I think the neurologists in 2018 and 19 had it more right than we've had it since.
Hmm.
And unfortunately, and this is the sad part for me, is there were writings at that time that you can go back and find and read that made a lot of sense. And they even laid out some approaches for research to kind of further our understanding of it. And it just kind of got lost to history.
Hmm.
So in World War II, when soldiers were having breakdowns in combat, we called it, we re-understood what we were talking about, and we redefined it as combat fatigue. And the idea in World War II was that, and not that this is necessarily wrong, but the idea in World War II is that soldiers just get exhausted, and they can only be effective on the line for so long, and that eventually every soldier is going to succumb to some level of combat fatigue, wherein they need to be pulled off the line. They need to be given a chance to rest. A warm tent and a cot and hot food for a few days before they sent them back to the line. And that worked pretty well in World War II, but it changed our understanding of the long-term effects of what we were talking about here.
So continuing with the building a foundation of defining terms, I've heard operator syndrome used interchangeably with the term high allostatic load.
Okay.
Are those terms interchangeable, or is that something different?
Yeah. So that's a really good question. So in May, I was invited to present at Soft Week in Tampa. That's SOCOM's annual conference. And the title of the talk, it was a panel discussion. There were three of us. And the title of the panel was allostatic load. That's not wrong, but it's not necessarily what operator syndrome is. So the way I will bring allostatic load into this conversation is that, well, first let's start with the definition of allostatic load, and I'm just going to literally read the definition that we've been using. So this comes from 1993, and so two scientists named Ewan and Steller defined allostatic load as, quote, and I'm just going to read this, quote, the strain on the body produced by repeated ups and downs of physiologic response, as well as by the elevated activity of physiologic systems under challenge and the changes in metabolism and the impact of wear and tear on a number of organs and tissues can predispose the organism to disease. So to just kind of put that into language that I can understand, what we're talking about here is a burden or a challenge or a threat that affects all of our human physiological systems. So our nervous system, our neuroendocrine system, immune, metabolic, musculoskeletal, respiratory, cardiac, perceptual systems, and others. So all of these systems, which are all interconnected, right? I mean, we know our brain, what's going on in your brain affects your gut, and what's going on in your gut affects your brain and your and everything else. So if you have a brain injury, it affects your sleep. If you're not sleeping well, that's going to affect your hormone production. It's also going to have it's going to have a return effect on your brain, and so on and so forth. So the concept of allostatic load really is a hypothetical concept that is a way of understanding how we are affected when we have a lot on our shoulders. And it is a term that comes from the world of physiology. So we can think of physiological burden, and the way to think about allostatic load is it's not just a static hypothetical number, it's also cumulative. So the concussions you got in high school from playing football, the concussions you got from combatives, the concussions you get on a deployment years later, all of those add up. And the more concussions you have over time, the more damage to the brain. And it's true for all of our systems. So the way we represent operator syndrome is that it's a result of massive doses of cumulative allostatic load on all of the physiological systems. And when we talk about soldiers, combatants, we're talking about some unique types of physiological allostatic load. As a psychologist, as a civilian psychologist, I spend most of my day sitting at a desk. I don't have any blast exposures. I don't have any, I've never jumped out of an airplane, so I don't have that on me. Doesn't mean I don't have allostatic load. I do, and we all do. It's just that it becomes, in certain professions, it becomes both massive and unique, unique types of injuries that are specific to the profession.
So I think this is hopefully the last time I'll require some defining of terms, but we skipped one there. We talked about high allostatic load without explaining what allostasis is, and I'm a little bit excited to talk about allostasis on a human performance podcast because I think it's a good point towards like the strength and conditioning space where both of us have spent some time and we talk about it a lot on this podcast. Like clings very hard to the word homeostasis. And
Mm-hmm.
we love an old general adaptation syndrome
Yeah,
model of how the
yeah,
body responds to stress.
yeah, yeah.
And if people in the stress physiology world tend to talk more about allostasis than homeostasis, and I want to give you a chance to kind of riff on the concept of allostasis to explain allostatic load.
No, sir. I want to hear your definition of allostasis because you
Well,
probably know more about it than I do.
I'm probably going to screw it up and you can correct me afterwards. But my vague understanding here, like the homeostasis concept implies that after every stressor, you return to the same baseline, which
Or
we
you're
know is
hoping to achieve,
potentially hoping to. And then
potentially.
allostasis refers to the fact that that baseline does move, right?
Yeah,
After stressors, you don't return to the same baseline, you return to an adapted baseline.
right.
And sometimes that's a good thing, right? Sometimes we apply stressors on ourselves and we become more resilient to those stressors
Yeah,
in the
yeah,
future
yeah.
if we dose the amount of stress appropriately.
Right.
But if we dose the amount of stress inappropriately, we might return to a lower baseline because we reached too far into the harmful amount of stress. That's a simplified version of my understanding
Well
of
done. Impressed.
Yeah, I'm impressed too because that's you said it better than I think I would have. If so, and then just to kind of build on that, what's the performance equation? How do you get to high performance? It's usually high performance is usually hard work plus recovery,
Mm-hmm.
just to simplify it. Well, help refine that equation. Hard work plus recovery equals high performance. What would you add or subtract or
I would
multiply?
add, I don't know how I would phrase this necessarily, but just when I hear you say hard work plus recovery, to me, that is an old school biomedical, biological model of performance. I think I would look more towards contemporary, and some of this might get into psychology, quite frankly, but more of a biopsychosocial where hard work, recovery, and then something in there to do with kind of athlete experience, athlete perception, athlete expectation of some sort might lead to some of that too. I'd have to refine that, but that's
Yeah.
immediately what
Okay.
comes to mind.
Yeah. And then they're very, very broad terms I'm using here. So maybe it's
Sure.
work plus recovery plus mindset or
Yeah.
times mind
Yeah.
equals
Divided by
divided by
pounds plus music. Yep. Okay.
divided by Metallica.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
I think so take that equation or whatever version of that equation you subscribe to, and then put it out there as what do a lot of high performers actually do? They don't use the full equation or they don't optimize the full equation. If we go looking at what a Green Beret does over the course of a 10, 15, 20-year career, the hard work is there, probably a lot of the mindset, but I think we're not crediting the recovery portion of the equation enough. So if you put in too much hard work, and I'm going to the hard work is a very broad term, but so hard work includes all the training, all the deployments, all those experiences, but you don't give yourself the recovery piece of that equation. The recovery, you're not sleeping enough, you're not eating well enough, you're not doing some of the recovery activities, whatever that is, meditation, yoga, hot sauna, prayer, whatever, time with family, then I think your allostasis, so just to bring this back to allostasis, your allostasis gets changed. Or it never resets to where you hope it would reset to.
So since we already nerded out about allostasis for a second, and Drew started talking about what the equation looks like and things like that, in a second we'll get back to talking about operator syndrome. But I do kind of want to inject into this the term hormesis, because I think it's a extremely useful term that is like weirdly not talked about in the human performance space. As far as I mean, I don't find it very
Hormesis?
often.
Is that
Hormesis. And
Horm?
yeah, and you'll find it frequently in like toxicology. But it's a pattern that works really well with most stressors. And I'll post a link to the graph in the notes later or whatever so people can find it. But basically, if you look at like cell response to an exposure, you have like from 0 to a certain dose, you have what's called the no observable effect level. Nothing
Mhm.
happens if the dose is too low. Then from the point where you start seeing any effect to some higher level, you have the hormetic zone, where the dose is something that the system is capable of adapting to. So somewhere in there, you have a maximum response where you like dosed just enough stress that it experiences stress, but it gets more resilient later. So you could dose more the next time. But if you cross a certain line at the end of the hormetic zone, you hit the no observed adverse effect level, where we're kind of back to 0, nothing really changes, and then past that are toxic levels. And it's an interesting body of research. There's like discussion out there of like maybe there is a hormetic zone for radiation, but it's unethical to study that. We can't just like
Mhm.
microdose people on radiation and hope it turns out good for them.
Mhm.
But like people have talked about it with radiation, people have talked about it with exercise, people talk about it all the time with various toxins. And it's kind of what we're talking about here is that operators, by the nature of making it through selection, have a much higher hormetic zone. They can tolerate higher levels of stress and adapt to them positively, but that increases the risk of us miscalculating what that stress they can adapt from is and going
Mhm.
too far into toxic levels.
Okay, so this sounds a little bit like in psychology, it's known as the Yerkes-Dodson law,
Yeah, I
which
think so.
proposes an upside down U-shaped
Mhm.
distribution of performance. So with just a little bit of stress, you don't perform very well. As the stress goes up, you start performing better. And at some point, you reach a peak. And then if the stress continues to go up, then your performance comes down.
Like roughly, yeah, it's very similar. Like the graph looks similar to the Yerkes-Dodson law, other than the fact that it goes below the x-axis on the right end of the spectrum. Like you go negative at a certain
There
point.
seem
Go
to be a
negative.
lot of inverted U graphs in human
We got a lot of
research.
them. We got a lot of them.
Got a lot of.
A lot of inverted U's.
We need, maybe the three of us could get together and invent a new one.
Yeah, why
Yeah.
not?
Yeah. You make a name for yourself as inventing an upside down U-shaped curve. Well, I love the Yerkes Dodson law. I talk a lot about that with my undergraduate students because, many younger people in our society have this idea that stress is automatically a bad thing. And without appreciating that, without a little bit of stress, you wouldn't get out of bed in the morning.
Mhm.
Related to that, and maybe this also kind of gets into the hormetic concept and it's an old psychological concept called stress inoculation.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Little bit of stress is necessary. I mean, the idea is just like a vaccine. They inject a little bit of a pathogen into your arm, and that pathogen stimulates your body to produce, an immune response to protect you from that pathogen, so that when you're hit with a real dose of that pathogen, you've already got antibodies that can help protect you. And stress is the same thing. So a little bit of stress, once you've gone through it and successful, you've got an inoculation. Now you can handle a little bit more stress and a little bit more stress up to a point. So that without those stress exposures, we don't learn to become resilient. We don't learn to manage those bigger stressors. And childhood is when we're supposed to get a lot of that stress inoculation. We've kind of removed that from the equation of modern day childhood with the way parenting and public schools function to remove stress from the lives of children and adolescents.
I know we're here to talk about your book, but you're bringing to mind Coddling of the American Mind, Anti-Fragile, and Anxious Generation, which are all on my like top recommended books list at this point.
I think I have those all on my desk right here because
There you go.
I give my students reading assignments from some of those books.
Nice.
We mentioned recovery a while back, and I'm curious how much of the operator syndrome kind of milieu of different conditions, how much of that is related to the way in which we fight war these days? And what I mean by that is people deploy, they come back, they deploy, they come back, they deploy, they come back. And it's sort of
Yeah.
this, you kind of constantly have to be on. Whereas, and I think we may have talked about this when we had you on last time, you hear a lot with like World War II as an example. Guys were gone for a long period of time, and then they had this sort of natural deload as they sailed back to the United States, and then they were able to assimilate into society. And I'm just wondering what role that constant operational tempo has on the psyche of these individuals, where you might be at war on a Tuesday and in the grocery store the next week,
Yeah.
and rinse and repeat for a career, and inevitably you're going to have problems.
Right. Right. And think about it from the perspective of a firefighter or a law enforcement
Oh, even
officer.
worse, I would think.
Yeah, where you're on today and then tonight you go home,
Yeah.
or you do a 48-hour shift and then you go home. And not just that, but your deployments, just to use that language, apply that language to first responders, your deployments are on your home territory. You're not fighting on the enemy's territory. You're defending and protecting on your home territory. So you go out to eat with your family, you go to the grocery store, you still have the eyes in the back of your head. You're looking out for who's around, who might be there, who you might have interacted with before. I think this is a real issue and a real challenge for a lot of professions. When it comes to war, I think we first saw this with the Vietnam War,
Hmm.
where you could have a soldier in the jungle, and then it's their DEROS date arrives. So their tour of duty, as it was defined then, is over, and they're home 36 hours later. That was a pretty common when I used to do a lot of work when I was at the VA in the 90s, a lot of work with Vietnam veterans, and I heard that a lot. That 36-hour move from the jungle to the backyard was really jarring and disorienting. But even there, even in the Vietnam War, while they were overseas, they weren't having regular communications with their families back home. Nowadays, think about what we've been doing for the last 20 years. People have mobile phones, they've got the internet, they've got even in austere environments, there might be sat phones that they're able to make calls home with. So you might be on a phone call, and I've heard this from spouses. They're on a conversation with a deployed spouse, and in the middle of the conversation, they hear some loud noises, and then the call has to end abruptly because something's going on. That's got to be really jarring, I would think. Now it becomes normalized. If you do that for 20 years, it just starts to seem like it's normal. It's part of the deal. It's part of the job. But yeah, I'm sure that's something we have not really thought very deeply about.
Well, and as you're saying that, I almost wonder if like does focusing research on that area on the tactical space lead to discoveries on sort of the law enforcement firefighter space, or is it vice versa? Because like you mentioned, you could almost make the case that law enforcement firefighters, that exposure de-exposure phenomenon is way more prevalent, and you might find some interesting things there that could lead to some changes on the tactical side. Because you mentioned 36 hours, it's like in some cases maybe that's 30 minutes, it's your drive home,
Yeah, exactly.
which is crazy to think about. Alex and I were crafting this question before we brought you on, and it may not be completely fleshed out, but I'm curious with operator syndrome, giving it such a tactical blanket or like confining it to sort of a military setting, does that create a situation where we start to see folks identifying with this archetype of the quote unquote disabled veteran and
Mm.
then not recognizing that some of these same things are quite prevalent in a civilian population, but maybe just by a different name, and then therefore not recognizing the similarities and the crossovers when it comes to seeking treatment, et cetera. I don't even know if that makes sense, but we were kind of riffing on that before we had you on.
I mean, I think the short answer is yes. The longer answer is it's complicated.
Fair.
But so just mea culpa. I don't do any traditional clinical work.
Hmm.
I don't do any consulting outside of first responders and military populations. But if, in talking with, let's just say a family member or a friend who's having some struggles with some things that might seem like depression or anxiety, I might ask them questions about, well, how well are you sleeping? Have you had a sleep study? Do you go to regular primary care visits? Do you get your metabolism checked? Have you had your hormones checked? I do a lot. I would definitely have conversations about inflammation, chronic inflammation. What are you doing to limit the chronic inflammation? Or to say it another way, what's your lifestyle? And then from that, we can extract some thoughts about the inflammation. Oh, you eat a lot of fast food, you eat a lot of junk food, you drink a lot of sodas. Right there, I'm going to say you're putting an unnecessary allostatic load on your body that you don't need to put, and it's literally killing you physiologically. Because inflammation, chronic inflammation in the systemic inflammation, is a driver of depression,
Hmm.
but it's also a driver of obesity, diabetes, cancers, cardiac problems, autoimmune problems, et cetera. Essentially, all of our chronic illnesses are connected to or implicate. Chronic inflammation is implicated in all of the chronic illnesses. And that's really I mean, yeah, eating some blasts is going to cause inflammation, but our whole modern lifestyle is causing inflammation in different ways.
So
So I think you could take this framework, yes, and use it. You're having problems with concentration. Let's talk about what kind of brain insults you may have had in your lifetime, because certainly many people end up incurring at least impact force
Hmm.
concussions and subconcussions.
So I'm starting to think here because I'm connecting this to things we talk about a lot at my day job, and the population I work with is not dealing with blast overpressure, and they're not jumping out of planes, and they're not regularly using firearms and dealing with those toxic exposures and things like that. But I see a lot of people who like I can look at and say, hey, like based on the following data I have on you, you are not handling the amount of allostatic load you are currently under effectively. And those stressors are coming from very different places. They're coming from
Right.
occupational and psychological stress. They are coming from spending many hours a day in windowless rooms, staring at screens where an emergency could come up anytime and you have to stay vigilant even when there's not. Just a very different set of stressors, but similar systemic responses. And I'm
Mhm.
curious, and we haven't asked you this question, but I kind of know what your answer is, but how many of these conditions or sets of symptoms or whatever are currently pigeonholed into narrow treatment approaches when it would make more sense to apply a framework with an interdisciplinary approach? Because that's what I think I'm
Yeah.
getting at here is regardless of your population, the answer tends to be
Yes.
interdisciplinary.
Yes. 100% I agree with that. So think about this. This is something that I look back on now with astonishment. But when I was the frog being boiled slowly, I never even noticed it. But now it astonishes me to look back. So in my 30 plus year career since I completed my PhD, I've been faculty in 3 different medical school departments of psychiatry: Medical University of South Carolina, Baylor College of Medicine, and then University of Texas Medical School in Houston. Psychiatry departments typically have, 120, 150 faculty, heavily majority psychiatrists, but also many psychologists, but also you have other specialties. So I can remember having sociologist colleagues, geneticists, internal medicine docs, neurocognitive specialists, people who, really were neuroscientists, non-clinician neuroscientists. But never once do I don't think any of my departments, never once do we have a urologist or an endocrinologist. Never once, when I was working in the VA as a clinician, did our clinic collectively among us refer any of our patients to get a blood test to look at their hormones. So we have completely, and I mean completely, ignored hormones as the mental health industry. If you, if one of you young men have low testosterone for whatever reason, let's just say tomorrow, for some reason, your testosterone dropped down to 150, you would very quickly look like you're depressed. You would be feeling tired and down. You would not be enjoying anything, so anhedonia. You wouldn't feel motivated. You'd have low energy. You wouldn't be sleeping well. You'd be irritable, and you just wouldn't be performing or functioning. And you'd probably be saying to yourself, man, I'm feeling really depressed. People who know you would probably be telling you, hey, Alex, Drew, I'm worried about you. You seem really depressed. And then you go to see your primary care doctor. They put a PHQ-9 questionnaire in front of you, and you complete that, and you probably look like you're moderate to severe depression. From there, you'd very quickly probably be referred over to behavioral health, where you'd be prescribed an antidepressant medication and referred to a therapist. And nobody would ever think to check your hormones unless there was some other specific factor in there that would prompt that.
Do you, it's interesting that you bring that up because kind of my own health journey or whatever, I got curious based on some work that I do on the side and kind of functional health and holistic medicine and all that kind of stuff. Not necessarily naturopathic, but more to your point, like full spectrum diagnoses, things like that. And
Mhm.
I'm sensing that that's becoming more of an emerging thing. I mean, Peter Attia talks about Medicine 3.0 in his Outlive book, and it's certainly cool. And this might fall in line with more what we talked about with you last time. But when it comes to operator syndrome specifically, do you see a world where military medicine starts to move in that direction and become more holistic, become more interdisciplinary? Or do you think that we will be slowed down by this tendency to overdiagnose or perhaps keep things in silos? Like, what does that look like, do you think?
I think there are people who are reading and listening to Peter Attia And I recommend his book and my own book. It's a terrific book. And I think there are practitioners out there that are, and they tend to be functional medicine docs or regenerative medicine docs. Oftentimes, that's kind of the the word or the phrasing that you can find them under. But conventional medicine that we get from the VA, from Kaiser, from our private health insurance companies, from private healthcare systems really is not moving in that direction from what I can tell. It's still heavily siloed. It's still heavily fractured. The urologists and the psychiatrists are not communicating. They don't even know each other. Primary care docs who could and should function as sort of essentially the coordinators and the quarterbacks of everything. You'd like to think that they're making those connections, but they can't. They're not allowed to by corporate medicine up to some point. And the fact that they're essentially challenged to see 10 patients an hour, they don't have the time to really do their jobs well anymore. I mean, when you have 6 minutes allotted per patient, and if you spend eight minutes with one patient, then you got to make that up somewhere in that hour. Some other patients are only going to get 4 or 5 minutes. And one thing I frequently hear, because I tell guys and gals frequently, I'll say something like, well, take the operator syndrome medical paper in and educate your doc, show it to them, highlight some of the things in there that you think you might need help with and show it to them. What often comes back to me is like, well, my primary care doc will only talk about one problem at a time. So today we talked about sleep and I got the sleep referral, but I got to go back in 2 months to get the referral for the next thing.
Mm-hmm.
That ain't cutting it. That's just a dog that won't hunt. But that's what's happening. And as we go more and more to healthcare rationing, which seems probable given the political winds, the more we go towards single payer healthcare, I think that corporate model just gets siloed even more, and the wait times for individual interventions become more and more. I want to see if I'm consulting with you, Drew or Alex, and we're working through this kind of list. I want to get your hormones. I want to checked. I want to get your sleep lab study done. I want to get a metabolic panel done. And I want these things to happen now. I don't want them to happen 3 months apart from each other. I want them all to happen at the same time. And then from there, I'm going to want to say, well, so if your testosterone is low, we need to treat that immediately. Now that treatment could be it could be many different things. It doesn't necessarily mean exogenous testosterone injections. In fact, it probably doesn't mean exogenous testosterone injections. Maybe we get the stellate ganglion block first to reduce your physiological arousal so that you're relaxing better, so that your cortisol is quieted, so that you're sleeping better. And after a month of sleeping better, then we would reassess your testosterone because good sleep is when all of our hormones are produced and regulated in sleep. So if you're not sleeping well, that might be a primary cause of hormonal dysregulation.
Hmm.
So the way we're doing it now is a fail. It's a great big fail.
So I want to pin you down on something specific because you brought up testosterone, endocrinology, TRT as an option, things like that. And as a disclaimer before I ask this, I have recently discovered the body of research on how much patients remember from what medical providers tell them, and then what subset of that information is remembered accurately versus inaccurately. So
It's a weird body of research to get into, but carry on.
short version, assume they remember slightly less than half of what the provider told them, and assume that slightly less than half of what they remember accurately. So
So
I've
25% is what we got, and then they're
in the
doing like,
neighborhood. And because of that, I start taking with a large grain of salt anybody who's coming and bringing me secondhand information from a provider they talk to, yada, yada.
right.
But what I want to get to here is that I think there are a lot of service members and veterans who think that the solution to all of their problems is TRT. And they will tell you a story of they went to a provider and asked for TRT and the mean provider said no. And
Yeah.
I imagine there's much more to that story. And I'm curious from your perspective on looking in detail at some of these operator syndrome cases, how often is the solution exogenous hormones versus addressing the underlying causes of the hormonal deficiency through things that might be less sexy, like fixing your sleep and your diet and your exercise and all these things.
Right. Well, you've just you're hitting the nail on the head there with a key issue, and it's complicated. So first of all, my caveat: I'm not a urologist. I've never trained as an endocrinologist, so I have very limited, professional expertise here, other than what I've heard other endocrinologists say and in reading their work, in talking with them, and in looking at and hearing about what guys are getting in terms of their care. So I think there's levels of this. Right now, I think we have a negative, I think medicine has a negative bias against even testing hormones. And I think that bias is in part is hormones legitimately aren't going to be the same from day to day.
Mhm.
So whatever level you look like today, it might be different tomorrow, or it might even be different later in the same day. So frequently we want to make sure we have more than one reading before we can even call it a problem. And there's a resistance to even assessing it. And I think part of that resistance is there are stereotypes, but there's also legitimacy behind those stereotypes that some people are looking for testosterone treatments as a way to become more viral or as a way to get jacked. And we saw this last year. I think it was last year with a Buds candidate who
Hmm.
died a week. And part of the story there is in his truck, they found a variety of chemicals that he had been using, performance enhancing chemicals. He probably did not legitimately medically need testosterone, but as a performance aid, he was using it, and it cost him his life probably in that in that really extreme experience of Bud's Hell Week. So there's that. We are cautious about the misuse of testosterone. We also don't want to jump to conclusions. So many not psychiatrists, many physicians won't test for hormones unless there are clear signs or symptoms that they can identify. And that's appropriate too. You also have many of these clinics out there all over the country, and many of them are advertising on billboards in cities, come get tested. And are they legitimate clinics? Are they a lot of these clinics are really just trying to push products and make money by selling people, medical compounds and chemicals that probably aren't that either they may not need or may not be the right form for what they need. So there is a lot of room for skepticism. Let's acknowledge that. But why are we not testing people? Why is that not a standard part of a workup? If we think you're depressed before we start you on an SSRI, if you're a man, why wouldn't we check your testosterone? Because an SSRI isn't directly going to help your testosterone. It might help it over time because it might help you relax, it might help you sleep better, it might help you feel better in a few ways, but it's not really going to truly address a root cause. If your pituitary gland in your brain has been affected by blast exposures, for example.
Can we hit really quickly on some of the protective measures or maybe preventative measures when it comes to operator syndrome? Because I think we've touched on it kind of tangentially as we've talked, but are there things that people can do in advance? So for example, if I know I want a career in special operations, or if we're looking at ascension candidates and we kind of know what they're going to get into, and maybe we can't change the training as much as we'd like to, but are there things we can put in place from a behavioral standpoint or otherwise that would make
Mhm.
someone less susceptible to operator syndrome?
Yeah, yeah. I think there are, and I think there are pockets that are doing this, and frequently they're embedded in human performance and wellness programs within units and on bases. And some of it needs to happen at a cultural level. Kind of hate to say that, but
Hmm.
the rock star lifestyle that many operators live is probably part of at least a little bit piece of the problem. So here's an example. I have a good friend, a close friend, who's a retired Navy SEAL. His son is 19, 20-ish, wants to follow in dad's footsteps in some way. So he's prepping to enlist in the Navy and hoping to go to, selection, either for a SEAL or one of the other groups. But his dad is working with him using the operator framework right now, pre-career, saying these are some of the issues you're going to inevitably encounter. And let's start working now on helping do the things we can mitigate. So, this is going to sound kind of stupid, but it's simple, but eat right.
Mm.
Stop eating McDonald's, stop eating drinking 5 sodas or energy drinks every day. Put that stuff out the window. Try to eat real food. Now, I get it. You're training, whether you're a first responder or a soldier, your options of food may be limited. You may be, eating on the run, on the go. You may be traveling. You may be in austere environments overseas where you don't have access to the best food. I mean, my goodness, when I worked at the VA, even the VA cafeteria, you could not get a healthy meal in the VA. In a hospital cafeteria. You could not get a healthy meal.
Mm.
It was all fried chicken and tacos and French fries and sodas. And when I voiced, my thoughts on that to the relevant people, I was met with nothing we can do. We're selling what people will buy. So you put all the healthy stuff in there, nobody buys it. Okay, I get that. But can we at least do a better job of making quality food more available? So there's one thing. Prioritizing sleep. I mean, one of the problems, and we had a long discussion of this last week in Los Angeles with some of the tactical federal agents. They're running missions at night in urban areas. And I say missions, they're going out and executing warrants and taking down, drug houses and things like that. Well, that's happening at night, but they still often work during the day where they're shifting back and forth. So their job itself, imposes a demand on their work that makes it impossible for them to sleep a traditional normal, 10 to 6 or 11 to 7, 8 hour time in bed. So that's a real challenge, but it's one that you can work as a problem and do your best with. But what do guys do when they go on training deployments? What do guys do when they're overseas?
None of the above.
None of the above.
Yeah.
In fact, a conversation I often have with some of the guys I talk to, operators who might be in their mid 30s, and what they'll say is, well, if I don't go out with the team, if I don't go out with the unit, the platoon, whatever level we're talking about, they're
Hmm.
going to laugh at me. And so what are we all doing? We're all going out to the clubs or the bars. We're drinking till late or early in the morning. We're playing as hard as we work. We work hard, we party hard. And when you do that, you're really not there. You just cheated yourself out of the recovery that you need.
Hmm.
So yeah, it might be fun. Yeah, you're fitting in, you're keeping up with the guys. And frankly, that rock star lifestyle is part of what draws some people. I get it, and it's hard to turn down those temptations. But do you want to be an operator at peak health? Do you want to have a long career? You got to find a way to build in time to rest, sleep, and eat well as best you can. And by the way, the alcohol, let's put this into the conversation.
Hmm.
If we could take every operator and first responder in the world and just eliminate alcohol from their life and not replace it with some other bad drug, we'd solve a huge part of our problem. right
Don't
there.
get us started. We cannot go down this rabbit hole because we would spend a whole podcast on it. But Drew and I talk frequently about fast food on military installations and alcohol on military installations, and people get very, very defensive when you start to have conversations about those
I
things.
know, I know, I know. Some guys have told me, some younger guys have said to me that there is a little bit of a sea change happening in the cultures in some places, that there is more of an appreciation for the value of good sleep and not drinking as much. But yes,
I
it's still
genuinely hope that's the case. And there are indications, like a lot of the heaviest purchasers of alcohol on military installations are actually the retirees, not the currently serving service members. So maybe it is, maybe there's like a curve that's shifting off to the later end there. We'll see.
I just want to say one other thing here. I don't want to come across as sanctimonious. I'm not a teetotaler myself. So I get it. Alcohol is part of our lives. It's part of our culture. It's everywhere you look. It's legal. It's encouraged. It's like you can't walk into a restaurant without having them ask, what kind of beverage would you like? So, there's an implied, pressure right from the moment you sit down to order something to drink. And that's part of that restaurant and as part of that servers, that's part of their income is selling alcohol. So we it's complicated. Yeah.
Well, you've
I'll
already
leave it.
made the point that it's more about profit than people, but we'll set that one aside because we'll get worked up about it. And I'll ask you a question that gets us a little bit back on the rails here. And I know you've talked about this in the book and elsewhere, but detecting issues like operator syndrome and various of the subset symptoms of operator syndrome involve testing things that vary between individuals. So we have a range of what normal might be considered. And so if we test someone at a specific moment in time, we can say where they fall compared to this probably inverted U graph like we were talking about before.
The Gen Pop. It's the Gen
Exactly.
Pop.
Exactly. But we can't necessarily, unless we had baseline testing on that individual in the past, we can't say where they fall now compared to where they were before X, Y, and Z exposures. And we've seen some of this improving lately. It seems like there's improving awareness of the consequences of blast overpressure, and we're starting to get more cognitive baselines on a lot of people and things like that. But how important is having baselines for people
Yeah.
to track change?
Yeah. Yeah. Medicine has taken a shortcut. We compare any data point gets compared to the general population of similar age and sex in the general population. So if you take an IQ test and you score 115, that gets put up against the general population, and you're told that you have an IQ at the 85th percentile relative to general population. So yes, that's how we kind of use it in medicine. And this is a well-timed conversation because I'm actually working right now and was reading through this last night, a paper that I'm working on with a team of research physiologists led by a scientist named Reggie O'Hara. And Reggie's and his team actually worked this into this paper. So we're trying to develop a predictive model that we can use and apply it to operator syndrome based on different professions, different people. So hopefully this model becomes something that we can use for anybody. But that is part of the problem for operators. If we don't know where you were when you were 20 on your testosterone, on your intellectual functioning, probably many other variables, 10 years later, 15 years later, you're in your 30s, and now we're testing you and we're saying, well, it looks like you're within range. You're within normal, healthy range. So you're good to go. But what if you weren't normal in that normal range to begin with? So when we talk about certain professions and operators, we generally know have an IQ at about the 85th percentile. Is it fair to compare them to general population when it comes to making medical decisions?
No.
Is it fair to use the same threshold cut point for how we're going to define low testosterone in somebody who's been an operator versus somebody who sits at a desk all day.
No.
And I take back the word fair. It's not about fairness, but does it make sense? And I would say it doesn't
Mhm.
necessarily make. And we do the best we can. If we don't have a baseline reading of your testosterone from when you were 18 years old, the best we can do is to compare you to other people. But I'll give you a really specific example where this broke down. I had a friend, former DevGru operator, who was very depressed, legitimately depressed, a lot of issues going on. When we tested his including some hormonal stuff, but mostly sleep stuff, when we tested when he got his IQ tested or his cognitive testing done, they told him he was at the 85th percentile. And so they dismissed his concerns. The VA dismissed his concerns about cognitive functioning. When we tested him at a private clinic, and he got the same numbers, but he was treated. And a year later, subjectively, he was functioning and feeling much better. We retested him, and his IQ tested at the 95th percentile on the retest. So he legitimately had seen an intellectual impairment. Now we could say, oh, poor him, he dropped down to the 85th percentile. I wish I was at the 85th percentile, but that's just not reasonable. So that's a fail. That is a fail. We're trying to build that into our model.
If you were given the keys to the castle, so to speak, as the expert on operator syndrome, and knowing what you know about what
Castles
leads,
have
this one does. We can pretend the keys to the drawbridge, as it were.
these.
How would you restructure the the life trajectory? That sounds really dramatic, but like selection, assessment into sort of the career itself, and then post-career, how would you restructure that for the special operations operator to be as protective against operator syndrome as possible?
So that's well outside my area of expertise. Um, I don't want to say anything about what we should do differently in training because I just don't know. I'm sure there are some things, but I want to make sure I give the military full credit that training is super important.
Mm-hmm.
And we've known for thousands of years that soldiers can bleed in training or they can bleed in war. And it's better to bleed a little bit in training than to bleed a whole lot in war. So what you do in training is going to matter. Your performance is going to usually go to the lowest level of your training. So I'm not going to say, oh, we should stop doing blast, training with breaching, because we can't remove that. But what can we do? I think we can do cultural things like change the way we offer food and the way we think about drinking and partying. So that's kind of it. Maybe that's more at the level of the individual than at the level of a command. I think there's probably some things we could do to build in better monitoring of hormones and metabolic panels and things. I think that can and should be part of SOPs, standard operating procedures. Maybe we should build in more formal pauses with particular strategies and recommendations. There was a James Bond book and a James Bond movie where Bond is messed. So this is going back to something that was written in the 50s, where he messes up on some stuff, and M says to him, "You need a month off, and we're sending you to a spa." And they send him to this place where he's getting, I don't know, high colonics and massages and drinking, carrot juice all day long. And he's kind of upset because there's no champagne or pate. That's the germ of an idea. Maybe we need to be building in more spa days. Maybe we need to have more sort of, I hate to say mandated, but build it in culturally so that nobody gets laughed at if they take 2 weeks to do a full course of daily float tank therapy or some other type of therapeutic like that. And then I also think we're close to a frontier of some other novel therapeutics that I think may really be difference makers. So, for example, right now, the Air Force is using a proprietary version of transcranial magnetic stimulation with their operators, their PJs and combat controllers. And so TMS is a treatment for depression. It's an FDA approved treatment for depression. It involves like 30 sessions of very low dose magnetic stimulation being put into one side of the head, and it reverberates, it pulses back and forth across the cranium. And I think we're getting better at using it. There's a version of that called magnetic electronic resonance therapy that uses EEG readings to help fine tune the magnetic stimulation frequencies. And so what the Air Force is now doing is they're encouraging their operators, at least some of their operators, it may be base specific, but at some places they're encouraging them to go get a full course of this treatment in the middle of their career. And they're looking at, how does this improve performance? How does this reduce symptoms? And does this actually increase the longevity of a career? So to reframe it, are there novel therapeutics we can use to heal the brain during the course of a career rather than waiting till the very end of the career and trying to fix something that's already really damaged by that time?
Speaking of caring for it while they're in uniform, caring for it after they're out of uniform, we're approaching a close, and there's something that is on my mind around a lot of these issues. And the last time you were on our podcast, we were talking about VA disability type of things. And many of the conversations I've had around that tend to lead me back to wondering about the issue of, do the people who need care the most, are the people who need care the most also the least likely to seek out that care? Because I see a ton of people who have no qualms serving 3, 4, 5 years, maybe deploying, maybe not, maybe seeing combat, maybe not, and submitting a litany of, these are all the problems I need help with. And then I see guys who like live this hard, high exposure operator lifestyle for years, 10, 15, 20 years, tons of deployments, tons of exposure, but they aren't the type of people to ask for help. That's the same mindset that got them to that place in their career, so they're not going to ask for help after their career. Do we end up neglecting the exact population that is most in need of some of this stuff?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I don't exactly know the answer. I do know that when I talk to operators, almost none of them will go to the VA for care because they don't trust the VA or they've had a bad experience at the VA. So I think right off the bat, a lot of people just won't go to a lot of hard chargers won't go to the VA because they don't get what they need there. But that doesn't mean they're not getting care. It doesn't mean that they're not getting disability. I think right now the military does it differently than they used to do it even 5, 10 years ago. I think there's more of a push at the very end of a long career. So somebody who's say retiring at 20 years, usually and at least in special operations, quite frequently that last year of the career, they're taken off, they're not deploying or they're not deploying to the extent that they had. So they have more room to get medical appointments, to get their records together, to start doing things to set up their to look for a job, to start to get some transition training for the next phase of whatever their career in life is going to look like. So I think there is that happening now, but I think is it a mistake? It's probably more of a feature than a bug, but the VA doesn't really differentiate veterans on the basis of MOS, military occupational specialty. And there was a big DoD report that just came out recently that shows that incidence of suicides, so suicide risk, varies by MOS in a very predictable manner. So soldiers who had jobs that were more direct combatants, that involved weapon systems, that involve going outside the wire, that they are at much greater risk for suicide and many other, brain health, psychological problems, at least, which is logical. Unfortunately, I think the VA and society, most Americans don't really differentiate. They don't really have an awareness. They think of, oh, you were a soldier, you deployed, you therefore must have been in combat. You must have come under fire. You must have been in harm's way. And everybody who deployed is a hero under that understanding. I want to be clear. Everybody who deployed to some extent is a hero. They rogered up, they put on a uniform, they stepped into harm's way to serve their country. So no denigration at all to anybody who served. It's just that I think we have not put enough understanding into really looking at the people who have the more severe injuries, which are predictable based on job codes.
I think, and I know Drew has some closing questions and stuff, but you're making me think. I think, and as somebody who separated from active duty just a couple of years ago, I think my generation of folks in the military are benefiting from a correction and possibly an overcorrection that is an attempt to correct the wrongs of previous generations of veterans.
Yeah.
And I think that's at the root of a lot of this.
I think there's some fairness to that. Now, the other piece of it is psychologists like myself. There's a gazillion of VA psychologists now. So when you hire a gazillion psychologists, it's like buying 1,000 hammers. Everything becomes a nail. So with a gazillion psychologists in the VA and the largest mental health care system in the world, which the VA has, it's pretty easy to start calling everything a mental health problem. And I think we've overdone it in that sense. But to your point, that's probably a correction that, or an overcorrection, a vast overcorrection, in my opinion. But it is a response to what we weren't doing prior to about 30, 40 years ago. Yeah.
So two questions for you before we let you go. And the first one, with the book coming out and with operator syndrome getting more visibility, are you getting pushback, or are there any misconceptions that you see coming up?
Let's see. Well, one misconceptions. Yeah, I think the pushback and the misconceptions go together.
Mm-hmm.
And people rarely reach out to me and tell me, that I'm an idiot and that my ideas are all wrong. I don't get much of that. I have had somebody who was a retired 3-star in a meeting where I had just presented, stood up and raged at me for my ideas, saying that my ideas were very dangerous and would hurt recruitment, and might also create a mindset of pathology in operators. And I, those are legitimate things to wonder about. I address both of them directly in my book. So I wish this former 3-star had actually read the book before he made his remarks. And he prefaced his remarks by acknowledging he had not read the book. I mean, we all do this. We all think we know what we're talking about, and we launch into something with a strong opinion, and then maybe we get educated and we realize we were off base a little bit. But I don't think operator syndrome. I don't think anybody's is not joining the military, is not volunteering for assessment and selection in special forces because of operator syndrome or the risk thereof. We do have a recruiting problem in the military, and we have a recruiting problem right now in law enforcement across the country. I think those are for social reasons far more than they are for concerns about specific injuries. That's probably a whole other conversation to get into.
And then the last question I have for you is, where are kind of the future areas of research that you're most interested in as pertains to operator syndrome, or even beyond that? Like, where do you think the horizons are, so to speak?
I think there's many of them. And so one of them is sort of the large picture. And so this paper I'm writing with Reggie O'Hara and his team, trying to develop a theoretical model that we can apply to operator syndrome, that opens the door to some very, I think, very elegant, that's the word I meant to say, elegant research designs to begin to study the phenomenon. And if we can study it and begin to predict the course of it, then that allows us to identify points to address, points where we may want to try to make changes. The other area is just on specific novel interventions. This MERT treatment, this variation of TMS I mentioned a few minutes ago. I think there's more research to be done there, and maybe we find ways to really take that and make that a true solution. I think there's a colleague of mine named Rich Aukus, who's an endocrinologist at the University of Michigan, recently published a first author paper in the New England Journal of Medicine on hormones that I think is going to have implications for how we evaluate and treat and monitor testosterone levels and hormones in soldiers. So I think, if we think of, we've talked about medicine in lanes. So each of these lanes, I think, has room to go forward. Right now, there's people doing research on blast exposures and trying to better understand that. Maybe that leads to development of better technologies to protect soldiers. The research that's being done with psychedelics and hyperbaric oxygen therapies and vestibular therapies. So I think there's just many, many therapeutics that are out there that are outside the box of traditional mental health care that I think we're going to see in the next 5-10 years being used much more than are now. And these are not interventions or solutions that will stop with operators. These are things that are going to work for all of us.
Well, we've gone nearly an hour and a half here. I just want to say this is round 2, and at many points during our second conversation on the podcast here, we identified topics we could do entire episodes on. So I think there's a high likelihood you'll be back. But
I look forward to round 3 with you guys. These are
all the way from Hawaii.
Well, since you're in Hawaii, round 3 should probably be an on-site recording where we come out and get some beach time and stuff. But we appreciate you. We'll be pointing people towards your book and appreciate all the work you're doing.
Thanks, guys. Really enjoy our conversations.
Guys, thanks for tuning in once more to Alex and I talking to people who have a lot to offer. Operator syndrome. What do you think?
Chris has been on other podcasts to talk about his book, and there have been reviews written of his book and things like that. We're not the first people to ask questions about his book, so I knew kind of what his talking points were. And to be honest, and this is something I like about our podcast, I don't think it would be fun to do podcasts if we weren't doing it, but I really enjoy getting people off of the stump speech version of their talking points that they're super comfortable with and intentionally dragging them into newer, slightly more interesting conversations that they don't have every single time they talk about it. And I think we successfully did that here.
Well, I'm just curious because we've talked to him about it now twice, and it's come up with other folks too. But it seems like we're heading towards this world where the emergence of tactical human performance and embedded subject matter experts, it's exposing a lot of areas of risk in traditional tactical culture. And then you also have guys like Chris doing some really cutting edge research on things that everybody knows are true. I mean, everybody recognizes that operator syndrome, call it whatever you want, it's a thing. But I just don't see a way how traditional military medicine can maintain its status quo as those two things become bigger and bigger and bigger. I mean, inevitably we're going to reach a tipping point where it's okay, we're either serious about human beings and optimizing human beings, or we've industrialized ourselves to the point of no return, and we have to figure one of those two things out. So I don't know what that looks like long term, but it seems to come up a lot as we broaden our scope, as it were.
I mean, I know there's this subpopulation of military people who just love the idea of war, but I think most military people are not that keen on war. and are like some of the people who can speak best to the horrors of it and stuff. And I'm thinking about this because he commented on that 3-star who stood up at the meeting and was like, "This is dangerous." You shouldn't
Probably
talk
likes
about this.
fast
It's gonna
food
hurt
on
recruiting."
bases, that guy.
Probably does, but it all comes back to a discussion of like, if the world better understanding the consequences of like warfare and combat, and even the consequences of training for warfare and combat, like blast overpressure and toxic exposures and things like that, leads to the world having a harder time finding people to die for stuff. Like, I'm not that upset about it. You know what I mean? Like, yes, I understand that like we need to defend the free world, and like I joined the military too. I got it. But like, we can have complicated conversations about these issues at the same time. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. It's okay to like know that service is important, but also that the world is imperfect and we should be moving towards something a little bit better, and having candid conversations about the fact that like firing Carl Gustavs all the time can fuck up your brain. Like, I don't think we should ignore that just because it's inconvenient for the military.
Or just assume that getting fucked up from that kind of stuff should be normal. And like,
Yeah.
oh, that's what you signed up for. It's like, well, like, it doesn't have to be. Like,
Yeah.
there's a reason why the NFL doesn't practice in pads all the time. It's because they realized it was stupid, and so they changed.
And historically, far more people die of like illness and disease and non-battle injury in every war ever than die of direct conflict with the enemy. And we've done awesome things to reduce a lot of those deaths.
That was
And that work should continue.
totally unrelated. But since you just mentioned that, I've loved people that listen. I've loved history of warfare forever and ever. Only recently, in the last several years, did I really understand that when they report casualties, that's not people necessarily just getting shot in the face. Like, there's a whole lot that goes into that. And that was really interesting. And it changes. I mean, it's still horrific, but it changes your perspective on what's actually at stake / causing people to die when it comes to war. So anyway,
if you're a nerd and want to like dive into the research side of all that stuff, the acronym you're looking for is DNBI, disease and non-battle injury. And it is the majority of casualties.
There you go. So I think we should end it here on notes of death and destruction.
Fantastic.
Yep.
See you next time, guys.
See you guys next week. Hey, Alex, let's cover our ass real quick.
Oh, great idea, Drew. All right, guys. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent.
Thanks for tuning into this week's episode. Before you go, please rate and review the pod on the listening platform of your choice. You can also visit us on our website at www.mopsinmos.com. That's mops, the letter N, mos.com. You can check out the library of podcast episodes, our latest blog entries, any helpful resources, and also sign up for our newsletter.
Drew nailed it. Just to underline a couple of things, the podcast entries have in-depth show notes on the website. So if you missed anything or you want to read any of the research we talk about, it is all there. You can, at the bottom of the website, sign up with your email and receive future updates from us. The blog posts go a little bit more in depth in kind of written form on a couple of topics we get questions about all the time. But most importantly, I just want to ask all you guys, our best way the word gets out is absolutely word of mouth. So tell your friends, tell the people you work with, anybody you think would find it useful. Thanks for spreading the word.
If you have any questions or comments, feel free to shoot us an email at either Drew or Alex at mopsinmos.com.
Or there's a contact form on the website.